at the Washington Antiquarian Book Fair.
Thank you.
A new book tells the story of 1,200 American employees of the National Security Agency who work in Yorkshire, England. This is the home to Echelon, a global eavesdropping system used by the NSA to spy on governments and people around the world. Now on Book TV, the author, Patrick Radden Keefe, takes you inside in the new book, Chatter. The program lasts about 50 minutes.
Hi. Thank you all for coming out. I thought I would talk a bit and read a bit and talk a bit and read a bit, and then we could do questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then take it from there. So I first got interested in this this sort of thing in the late 90s, about 5 years ago. I started hearing about this sort of planet-spanning eavesdropping architecture. Something that had not really been covered in the American press, and I was living in the UK at the time, and there was a lot more coverage of it there. This caught my attention, and I basically spent the better part of the last 5 years looking into it. So what I thought I'd do is start with a little episode fairly early on. This was in the summer of 2002, and a character that I met. I'll just read you a page or two about him. We live in a world awash in signals. In the wonderful opening scene of Krzysztof Kieslowski's film Red, a Frenchman picks up a telephone in his apartment in London and dials the number of his lover in Geneva. As the man dials, Kieslowski takes his camera along the phone cord, seemingly into the line itself, through a dense weave of tiny red wires, into a communications cable running underwater, then back up out of the water, under cities and through forests, through more wires and cables and switches, and eventually up to the woman's phone in Geneva. We follow the signal in the instant it takes between the last number he dials and the ring of the phone on the other end, and we gain an insight into the hurdle and flux of the communications system we so take for granted. Signals course through wires and are beamed by satellite ground stations. Signals surge from your cell phone to a microwave tower, and from that tower to a satellite, to another string of microwave towers, and to the phone of a friend in another country, all in an instant. Your internet activity is broken down into data packets that travel by fiber optic cable, pulses of light coursing down a strand of glass, the thickness of a follicle of hair. When you make a long-distance phone call to England over a satellite network, the signals travel through copper cables or between microwave towers until it reaches an uplink station and is bounced off of a satellite, hovering in geostationary orbit, 22,000 miles above the Earth. In order to get a sense of the world of signals as a material, physical thing, I arranged a meeting with a man named Alistair Harley. Alistair is a good-natured former MI5 surveillance man in his 40s. So this is in Great Britain, and he worked for the British domestic intelligence agency, MI5, with a boyish grin and very short blonde hair. In the early part of his career, he would sit on hilltops between microwave relay towers with sophisticated listening equipment, intercepting calls and messages and acting on the intelligence they produced. Now that he is out of that world, he works as a freelance computer and communications security expert. From what I could glean, this seems to involve hacking into the computer systems of various companies and organizations, then telephoning them shortly after they have identified the breach and offering his services in preventing that sort of thing from happening again. I met him in the cathedral town of Ely, just outside of Cambridge, England. We walked through the train station parking lot until we reached his car, a small blue sedan bristling with antennae. A dozen wires of various sorts jutted out all over it. "Yep, that's mine," Alistair said as we approached. "The Porcupine." Over the next several hours, Alistair and I drove around the area near his house, listening. The dashboard of his car was a jumble of receivers and switches, black wires and knobs. He fiddled to get the right frequencies as we zipped along, listening to the messages flying around us. As we drove down empty roads, without a person in sight, the inside of the car sounded like a cocktail party in full swing. Cell phone conversations, the bark of walkie-talkies and CB radios, the gibberish of encrypted calls. This was in the summer of 2002, and on the other side of the planet, the war on terror was underway. We stopped at Lakenheath, the largest American Air Force base in England. Bombers and supply planes bound for Afghanistan maneuvered on an endless runway. Alistair fiddled, and soon we were listening to exchanges between ground crews and the control tower as the planes were readied for takeoff. "It works out well," Alistair told me. "I can sit at the end of the runway and look like an aircraft spotter." For the first few minutes, I didn't even register that the voices crackling through the receivers and into the car were not British, but American. It was a peculiar kind of voyeurism, the knowledge that the flight plans of American F-15s would qualify as extremely valuable intelligence for a broad assortment of enemies of the United States, and that the signals were right there in the air, asking to be listened to. "If you listen to the ground crews at night, you can hear their mission briefing for the next morning," Alistair told me with an excited grin. He explained that as a general rule, if it uses radio waves, there is nothing that cannot be intercepted, monitored, stored. There's certainly not a lot around here, voice and data-wise, that I can't intercept. And with the agency's equipment, it must be tenfold. So having had that sort of early experience and gain an appreciation for just how easy it is to intercept communications, I started looking into the particular agencies that do this. In the United States, the primary agency is the National Security Agency, which a lot of people haven't heard of, but is actually larger than the CIA and the FBI combined. It's the biggest intelligence agency in the U.S. and, in fact, the world. And it's fascinating. They have 40,000 employees in Maryland, at Fort Meade, Maryland, at their headquarters, but then another 20,000 employees, Americans, scattered all over the planet at these listening stations where they are able to intercept communications. So I'll read you a little bit about the biggest of these stations, which is in England, and it's called Menwith Hill. I went to see this base, which is really sort of in the middle of nowhere, and it was a fairly illuminating experience. "You cannot help but note the juxtaposition. Here away from the world, amid rolling pastures, on a tract of land where the air is redolent of cow dung, lies the most sophisticated eavesdropping station on the planet. England's North Yorkshire moors are, after all, cow country. Leaving the elegant Victorian spa town of Harrogate, my taxi winds west through 8 miles of verdant countryside." One of the things that I experienced over there was that there are these bases, and in fact, in the countries we're allied with and doing this kind of work. I mean, in Australia, we have 30 military and intelligence bases. In England, some similar number, and there's a lot of resistance actually within the local populations. And so, as I was doing my reporting for the book, I got invited to attend a protest on the 4th of July outside Menwith Hill. So I'll just read you a little bit about that. So this was some time later, but on the 4th of July. "The American flags fluttered upside down at Menwith Hill. I had been invited to join the annual Independence from America rally outside the gates by Lindis Percy of the Campaign for the Accountability of American Bases, or CAB is the abbreviation. Lindis has watery blue eyes and a lined, very tanned face and a quick, toothy smile. Her hair is cropped in a sandy, windblown mullet. She has an uncanny resemblance to Vanessa Redgrave. Together with her partner, Annie Rainbow, a wheelchair-bound chain smoker with a gruff way and an easy laugh, she campaigns tirelessly against the American military and intelligence presence in the English countryside. Her protests sometimes involve marches, like the one planned for that day, the 4th of July, but more often seem to involve Lindis simply jumping a fence and waltzing onto a base. In the name of research, she routinely penetrates the defenses at various bases and wanders around, making her way into storage rooms and cafeterias before being apprehended by the military police. The situation at Menwith Hill was sufficiently bad that several years ago the base received an injunction barring Lindis from the site, an injunction that Lindis proceeded to violate 114 times. The local lads at the Black Bull Inn seem slightly baffled by the generally female peace campaigners who have occasionally camped out near the base over the years. For reasons that I suspect are less than scientific, they refer to these women simply as the lesbians. Lindis they know only as the head lesbian. As my taxi pulled up outside Menwith Hill for the first time since my initial visit to the site, a British policeman walked toward the car with a handheld video camera, pointing it at me. It was a strange feeling, but I soon found that when you're running with Lindis, you get used to such things. About a dozen people, some young, nose-ringed and dreadlocked, others women in middle age, were gathered around a blue van parked on the road facing the base. The bus was draped in an upside-down American flag with the words "Independence from America" silk-screened on it. A handful of police in bright yellow jackets stood uncomfortably by the entrance. A guy walked around handing out copies of Socialist Weekly. Aging hippies exchanged pleasantries over enormous thermoses of tea. Inside the van, Lindis was filling balloons with whiny gasps from a helium canister. She told me about a possible contact, a former signals intelligence officer she knew. Signals intelligence is the shorthand for eavesdropping by these agencies. So signals intelligence, or SIGINT, is the term. So she told me about this guy that she knew who might talk to me for the book. And I think he's legitimate, she said. I've checked him out because... She looked at me knowingly as her voice trailed off. I nodded, knowingly, thinking that she meant that some of these people can be paranoid cranks, and said, "Oh, I know. Because, well," she continued, "infiltrators, you know." The balloons said, "Stop Star Wars," and as Lindis filled them, volunteers tied them to a makeshift table holding flyers and cab newsletters. The morning was cool, and the balloons bobbled and snapped on their strings in the wind. The papers were held down with stones and seashells. I flipped through the newsletters. Bylaw fiasco continues, latest on Echelon, and became aware that the squat military policeman who had registered me with his camcorder when I got out of the taxi was still pointing the damn thing at me. He stood on the street holding the camera in front of him, looking at me through the viewfinder. I glared. I did not want to adopt the combative rhetoric of my hostess. After all, this guy was just doing his job, but his persistence struck me as a fairly transparent bid at intimidation. Our staring contest continued until a station wagon slowed down next to him and a woman in a tie-dye t-shirt said, "Excuse me, where would it be best for me to park?" Startled by this sudden demotion from big brother to little traffic cop, my quarry lowered his camera and gave her directions. "I find it offensive to be photographed like that," an old woman standing next to me at the table announced. "And you know, I know what the Africans mean when they say it takes away your soul, because that's the way it feels." With traffic flowing smoothly, my policeman raised his camera again. On a whim, I walked over and said, "Excuse me, why are you filming me?" "Evidence gathering," he said. "Are you American?" He seemed surprised. "Yes," I said. "If you're gathering evidence, what was the crime?" "We're gathering it in advance," he said, "in case a crime is committed." I contemplated this for a moment. "Have you ever been to York?" he asked, suddenly dropping the pretense of hostile authority. No," I said, "I haven't." "Most of our Americans' friends love York," he said. "Is it mainly Americans inside, then?" I asked. "Well," he said, then paused. "We're really not supposed to say. But yeah, we've got a lot of Americans." Then he gazed out at the array of upside-down American flags and added, "We have very good relations with the Americans." Back at the van, Lindis had taken up a megaphone and was encouraging people to join her in reciting from a document that was being passed around, the Declaration of Independence from America. She pointed out that this year the Americans inside had been forced to hold their Independence Day jamboree the week before because they knew CAB was coming. And with that, the assembled crowd began intoning the preamble, which went, "When, in the course of human events, a greater state imperils the safety and continuance of a lesser," and so forth. Feeling a bit awkward in my role as the only American outside the fence, I gazed around. There were some 30 protesters by now, and the age range was astonishing. 2 girls who looked to be about 14, wearing baggy jeans with chipped nail polish, held a banner that said, "We need trees, not bushes." Next to me, a 30-something woman whispered in the ear of a paraplegic in a wheelchair. An elderly woman with a wooden peace sign hanging around her neck held a banner with her husband, who leaned on a cane. What annoys me is we walked from Brayton to Selby, and our son Jonathan was on my back. Brayton and Selby are another of these 2 big American bases in the English countryside. "We walked from Brayton to Selby, and our son Jonathan was on my back," she said. "And now Jonathan is 50. They had been decrying the American bases for half a century and had achieved nothing, and still they came, early on this July morning, to protest. I wondered how effective it was as anything but a stunt. The flower child aesthetics, the anti-Americanism undermined somehow by its own virulence, and that tragic flaw of the radical left, a surfeit of different agendas. As the reading of the Declaration progressed, I overheard a young Irish girl, wide-eyed and dreadlocked, remark to a new acquaintance, "The other thing I'm into now is refugees." As I looked at Lindis and the van and the protesters and the gates to Menwith Hill, I noticed that the Declaration was hardly reverberating over the ancient moors. On the contrary, those protesters who weren't chatting among themselves seemed to be mumbling and flubbing the words. the way you would a prayer whose gist you remembered better than its particulars, or the Declaration of Independence itself. How are we for time? I guess I'll do one more little section. Y'all familiar with total information awareness? Does this ring a bell? I won't describe in any great length what it was. It's more the aftermath that I'm interested in. But it was a system basically that was going to aggregate all of the public and private databases around the country as proposed by the Pentagon after September 11th. And the idea was that if you could pull together all these databases and get them all together into what they called it a metabase. If you had this metabase, you could enter somebody's name or their social security number and gain all of the information that is basically out there, your credit card transactions, your phone calls, where if you have a GPS chip in your phone, where you are at a given moment in time. This was interesting to me because it ended up sort of the system got scuttled in the end. It didn't end up going through, but I was interested in the reaction in the United States to revelations about this system. So I'll just read you a page or two about the kind of funny reaction to it. The organization that was setting up total information awareness was called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, sort of the R&D wing of the Pentagon. The problem was DARPA's public relations instincts were atrocious. To say that the leaders of the agency's new Information Awareness Office had a tin ear would be to grossly understate the case. In fairness, the system was so ambitious and seemed to have so little regard for personal privacy that it was a hard sell from its very inception. As details about TIA, Total Information Awareness, emerged, Mark Rotenberg, the director of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the watchdog group in Washington, described TIA as the perfect storm for civil liberties in America. In an editorial, the Washington Post remarked, "Anyone who deliberately set out to invent a government program with the specific aim of terrifying the Orwell-reading public could hardly have improved on the Information Awareness Office." Seemingly oblivious to the danger of such a reaction, TIA's architects made one gaffe after another. Who, for instance, thought up the name Total Information Awareness? Did no lowly functionary at no preparatory meeting pipe up and suggest that if the Pentagon was going to unveil a system that would unsettle those concerned with individual privacy and nervous about the prospect of an all-seeing branch of government, it would be a little counterproductive to give the program a name that screamed 1984? Similarly, no voice of reason intervened when the agency opted to have the symbol of the Information Awareness Office be a pyramid with an eye at the top of it that looks out at the planet Earth in the foreground. If you have spent any time among conspiracy theorists, you'll know that pyramids and eyes are laden with symbolic importance for your average paranoid. Take the pyramid and the eye on the $1 bill. These are seen by many, among them Alistair Harley, the guy who took me around in the Porcupine listening to signals, as incontrovertible evidence of a Masonic conspiracy at the bosom of the Treasury Department, if not the U.S. government itself. There's another centuries-old conspiracy theory about the Illuminati, a tiny cadre of powerful politicians and businessmen who rule the world. Their symbol, an eye atop a pyramid. In case anyone had any doubt about the program's intentions, the website for Total Information Awareness bore the motto Scientia est potentia, knowledge is power. Eventually, in May 2003, the wily strategists at DARPA opted to change the name to something that, while still radiating strength and competence, would seem at least cosmetically a little more geared toward capturing the bad guys. The new name? Terrorism Information Awareness. You can imagine the satisfaction of not having to ditch all of that monogrammed stationery. Nevertheless, this gesture was widely regarded as too little too late and reminded me of the Stasi's decision in the waning moments of the German Democratic Republic to change its name from the Ministry for State Security to the Office of National Security, which might have succeeded in softening the image of the secret police had it not resulted in the disastrous new acronym Nazi. And then there was the director of the TIA program, chosen with the tact and savvy DARPA had made its very own, Admiral John Poindexter. As National Security Advisor to Ronald Reagan in 1985 and 1986, Poindexter had been a key figure in the Iran-Contra scandal, in which the Reagan administration secretly sold arms to Iran and diverted the profits to help rebels in Nicaragua. The man at whose fingertips DARPA chose to place the personal secrets and information of all American citizens had been convicted in 1990 of 5 felony counts of lying to Congress, destroying official documents, and obstructing Congress's inquiry into Iran-Contra. Those convictions were ultimately overturned because testimony was used against Poindexter at trial that he had given Congress under a grant of immunity. But the taint of Iran-Contra clung to him nevertheless, stale as cigar smoke, and should have rendered him unemployable on any high-profile government project, let alone one so apparently prone to abuse. It's hard to tell which was the final straw, but the combination of the program, the name, the symbol, and the director struck a nerve with the public, particularly the web-savvy public. And before long, Poindexter found that venturing into the waters of secrecy and privacy can make for a treacherous crossing. On November 27, 2002, Matt Smith, a columnist for SF Weekly, an alternative newspaper in San Francisco, wrote about total information awareness. Other journalists had been writing about the program, but Smith's column was a little bit different. He started out by lamenting the emergence of TIA and wondering to what uses this powerful new database could be put. Then he changed course. Optimistically, I dialed John and Linda Poindexter's number, 301-424-6613, at their home at 10 Barrington Fair in Rockville, Maryland, hoping the good admiral, an excused criminal, might be able to offer some insight. A pleasant-sounding woman I think may have been Linda, the former Episcopal priest and now effusive Catholic, answered the phone. Smith's point was hard to ignore. What happens when the tables turn? The information he gathered was all publicly available. He had simply been resourceful enough to see what he, one journalist, without the formidable resources of DARPA at his disposal, could gather. And he was able to gather a great deal. Why, the column continued, is there a $269,700 Rockville, Maryland house covered in artificial siding? According to Maryland tax records, shouldn't a Reagan conspirator be able to afford repainting every 7 years? Is the Donald Douglas Poindexter listed in Maryland sex offender records any relation to the good admiral? What do Tom Maxwell at 8 Barrington Fair and James Galvin at 12 Barrington Fair think of their spooky neighbor? Reading the column generated a strange mix of feelings in me. On the one hand, I felt terrific excitement, the warm glow of vindication in watching the mighty brought down. On the other hand, this information was also readily available that it was unsettling to think how much more can be obtained through TIA and programs like it. And finally, there was a Wizard of Oz sensation. Without the mystique of secrecy, even the supposedly all-powerful doyens of the surveillance establishment were exposed as ordinary people, living in houses with artificial siding. What followed was a full-fledged assault on the Poindexter clan. Smith may not have appreciated quite how rich was the vein he was tapping into. He told me recently that his column does not generally deal with technology or civil liberties, and that he had been on deadline on a Friday night and unhappy with another column he'd been planning when a friend suggested he write about Poindexter. Within days, however, Smith's call to arms had raced around the country and the world, and it goes without saying, the telephone at 10 Great Barrington Fair was ringing off the hook. So that's it. I'd love to answer any of your questions, or we can discuss.
I got 2 questions. The first one has to do with the European Union legislation against Echelon, and the second one has to do with the leaking, or the NSA was listening to Osama bin Laden, and then it was leaked by the press. And the author of Imperial Hubris believes that 9/11 would never happen if that wasn't leaked. So could you speak about that?
Sure. Let me answer those in turn. The first question was about the European Union, and there wasn't actually any legislation passed. The European Parliament, there's a chapter in the book about how the European Parliament did an investigation of Echelon. And basically, this is in the late 90s, tried to gather as much information as they could about the system. And they ended up publishing a report, which is a fairly good sort of collection of a lot of the stuff that we have out there, and corrected some of the conspiracy theories. And you can find that online. There's no legislation passed. The one issue was that in the European Union, they have the Data Protection Act, which is a sort of a piece of privacy legislation that's across the European Union, which was awkward for Great Britain because as part of this secret intelligence alliance with the US, it had conflicted loyalties. The second question was about a sort of a famous case, which is that in 1998, there was a story in the Washington Times saying that the National Security Agency was able to listen in on Osama bin Laden's satellite phone. And the day the story came out, he stopped using the phone. And Michael Scheuer, who until recently was anonymous, the author of Imperial Hubris, was one of the people who was getting that intelligence in the late 90s, listening to bin Laden. And he has come out and said that he thinks that you can lay the blame for September 11th on the doorstep of either the journalist who published it or, as Scheuer is quick to point out, the Defense Department official who actually did the leaking in the first place. Yeah, the Washington Times, actually. Yeah. Any other questions?
Would you like to talk about your efforts to get the NSA to talk to you?
Sure. Could either be a very long story or a very short one, depending on how you look at it. I made several overtures to the agency directly, not until I'd actually done a good amount of my research, because I figured if I sort of walked in the front door, it was very unlikely that they would give me the time of day. But I basically did all my research and then started approaching them last year, and made numerous entreaties to them, essentially arguing that there has to be some level of accountability, not necessarily to me personally, but to Congress and to the press. And the agency has been, the joke is that NSA stands for no such agency, or never say anything. And I certainly found that to be the case. So it was interesting because, I mean, they completely shut me down and wouldn't let me in. But in some ways that made it, it meant I had to use some ingenuity in terms of doing research, which was fun because, I mean, there are all these places where you can actually find loads of information. So if I went to them and said, do you have these technologies, A, B, and C? They would say, we never comment on any of our technologies. But it emerges that in the last 20 years, they've been taking out patents. And the devil's bargain of patent law is that when you want a patent on a technology, you have to publish the thing that you're patenting. So if you go to the website of the USPTO and run a search for NSA, you come up with 200 patents. So I mean, there were sort of ways around that. But I think it's a huge problem that it's a $6 billion budget every year, 60,000 employees. I think what they do has a real impact and will on on how safe we are and the kind of country we live in. And there's very little accountability. Yes.
Can you comment on what your opinion is of whatever congressional oversight currently exists?
I think it's pretty shoddy for a whole variety of reasons. I think that the congressional oversight committees on intelligence, I think, have become something of a rubber stamp. There's a huge amount that they're not allowed to know, even in closed-door sessions. There's an incident I recount in the late 90s that the House Oversight Committee, in fact, Porter Goss, now the head of the CIA, appealed to the NSA and said, we've heard about this Echelon system, we want to know about it, at least in a sort of bare-bones sense, and we want to know, are you using it on Americans or not? Are you listening in on Americans? And the NSA used a kind of particularly squirrelish legal loophole to get out of that. They said that they had attorney-client privilege with their attorneys not to give any of the information away. So basically this meant that if you dropped whatever document it was on the desk of some NSA lawyer on the day that you got the phone call asking for the document, you could say, oh, no, we can't give it to you. So they haven't been completely cooperative. And also the technical issues now are, I think, beyond the capacities of, and I mean, I'm not, senators have said this, people on the committees have said there are these incredibly technically complex issues that we don't fully fathom. And we're not necessarily in a position to make these judgments. So, for instance, the single largest item in the intelligence budget for 2005 is a $9.5 billion satellite program. That's amortized over several years, but nevertheless a fairly expensive little expenditure. That several senators have come out and said, members of the committee have said, we don't think it's a great idea and we don't really understand it. We think there should be more debate. We need people to explain this to us more. But it's gone through. It's in the budget. I'll just quickly add that the one kind of jump out line on congressional oversight for me was I talked to Bob Kerrey, who had been the ranking Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee and is now the head of the New School downtown. And his little quip was that a lot of senators on the committee are only on it because they like the travel opportunities that come to them.
Is the NSA under the control of the president or under the authority of the president?
Yes, it's under the Department of Defense, so they would answer to Rumsfeld. But I mean, again, I feel as though, as far as oversight mechanisms, I mean, you can look at it on a piece of paper, but how much communication there actually is and oversight there actually is going up and down, is not very promising.
If the president disagreed with something, does he have the authority to enforce his opinion, or he has to go through people who
He would go through the
consider
Secretary of
themselves
Defense.
Independent?
He would go through the Secretary of Defense. It's my understanding. I mean, part of the problem though is that I don't know that he would even know necessarily. For instance, it's amazing, the system, the Echelon system. One of the parties to it was New Zealand, and there's a reporter in New Zealand who wrote a book about this system, and it was published I think in 1997 called Secret Power, and when he was done, he brought it to David Lang, who had been the Prime Minister of New Zealand during the years when the system really grew, and he gave it to David Lang. And David Lang read it, and he said, "I'm completely scandalized. I had no idea. I was the prime minister. I was the one who actually oversaw the construction of some of these bases, and I didn't know the level of cooperation in an international sense. I didn't realize that they were being used for these purposes."
In some sense, the CIA or the NSA can they be considered semi-independent, and they can exercise their own will or resist the will of a given president and pursue their own agendas?
I think in principle, yes, there would be more room for that than there might be for other agencies. But having said that, I don't, the specter is always of the agencies in the 1960s. The sort of rogue elephant on a rampage is what they said about the agencies in the 60s, and really pursuing their own agendas. And I don't think that's happening now. I mean, I think that actually it's what I've realized is that they're struggling to keep up. I mean, they're doing the president's bidding and sort of, I think, ultimately failing to carry it through. So, what else?
So at the end of the day, what did you learn after all of this?
I think what I learned was that it's there are real changes happening that in terms of our safety and our security, and also in terms of our privacy, and they're happening very, very quickly. And I don't think we're aware of them. The American press has an allergy to covering these kinds of stories, and I think that is really to its detriment and to our detriment. I think that when we don't talk about these things, you get things like an ill-considered $9.5 billion satellite program that nobody really got a chance to sort of stand up and put any kind of a counter-argument against. I mean, similarly, Mike Hayden, who until recently was the director of the NSA, and interestingly has just been appointed deputy national director of intelligence under Negroponte. People felt that Negroponte didn't have enough sort of intelligence bona fides, so they put Hayden there. But in his capacity as director of the NSA, Hayden actually went to Congress several years ago and said, "I'm in a real situation here where we have all these technical things we could do that might make us incrementally safer, but we also don't know what that would do for American society and the kind of country we would live in." And he actually said to Congress, "I need you to go back to your constituents and say to them, where should we draw this line between liberty and security? Because we're here, developing these new technologies and trying to sort of keep us safe, and we don't know how much license do we have." And it's interesting because I didn't read that in the newspaper. I had to chase that down in the congressional record. I mean, that story never got picked up on. And here you have a guy who has fairly formidable resources at his fingertips, and and he's actually asking for debate, and there is none. So I think if there's something I came away with, it's that these are things we should be discussing, and I think that we shouldn't allow the fact that it's not in the New York Times to stop us. I mean, last year there was a story about how the National Security Agency and the British Eavesdropping Agency were listening in on diplomats, UN diplomats, in New York to try and figure out how they would vote on a resolution to go to war in Iraq, and the Times didn't run a story on it. They didn't touch it. And the eavesdropping was actually happening on the east side of Manhattan. And it's been, this is not a conspiracy theory, this is true. And it never impinged on the consciousness of those of us who get our news from the paper of record.
Of all the countries involved in this agreement for Echelon, what's your experience in terms of which country's press you feel is doing the best job of covering it?
I think that it's two answers. The British press is certainly the most vigilant and aggressive on these things, partially because in Britain it's sort of a fait accompli already. I mean, they read about surveillance a lot because they really live in something that more closely resembles a surveillance state than anybody else in the world. But it's easier for people working in Australia and New Zealand because it's smaller scale. They're smaller countries. There's much less security there. So this guy, Nicky Hager, for instance, who wrote a book in the mid-'90s about New Zealand's role in all this, he just sort of waltzed into some of these bases. At one point, he waltzed in with a video camera. He was apprehended eventually. But I mean, you go down to the NSA and try that, and you believe me. I mean, you won't get very far.
Hi. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how serious and real the basic threat of privacy is. Do you think? I think we all think it's pretty serious, but do you think it's just a kind of reaction to things going on, or do you think it has some longevity and real stability, or do you think it just, yeah?
I think it's funny. I'm not as dogmatic as some people are on this. I'm neither dogmatic in the security sort of end of the spectrum or the privacy end. And it's funny. I mean, you could sort of think of that as me being indecisive or wishy-washy. But on the contrary, I mean, I feel as though the problem is that we're not discussing these things. So as far as the privacy issue having real kind of long-term consequences, I think it absolutely will, because there are changes happening every day already, and they're happening without much public discussion. And I feel as though 15 years from now, we're all going to wake up, and maybe we'll be safer and maybe we won't. I would argue that probably all of this new technology isn't actually going to keep us all that much safer. And we'll sort of say, God, how did that happen? When did that happen? Nobody asked me. In that regard, I think that it's significant. Having said that, if there was more debate about this and there was more coverage of it, and we decided as a country, I'm willing to barter X amount of liberty for Y amount of security. If you can guarantee me I'll be safer, I'm willing to give up this and that and that. Far be it from me if the United States decides in anything resembling a democratic way that that's a choice we want to make. Far be it from me to object to that. I just don't think that's actually happening. I think that this is driven by the security establishment and also increasingly by private research and development companies that are, I think a lot of these companies are snake oil salesmen. They go to government agencies who are desperate and worried that they're not able to hold it all together, and they say, I've got this brilliant silver bullet new technology. It'll, you get a phone conversation in Farsi, and it'll be able to translate it all for you in seconds. And that's, if you talk to somebody who's actually translated Farsi, they say that's just a lie at the end of the day. It's not possible. So.
When you were living in the UK, did you find that there was at least more awareness with the British people on these issues? I'm from the UK myself originally, and I have conversations all the time with people there about the war in Iraq and everything. And I'm constantly being told things that do not appear in the press here. And for instance, demonstrations. I never heard about demonstrations. I read the New York Times almost every day. So I wondered what your experience was with that.
I think there is vastly more awareness. But I think it cuts both ways, because part of this really comes down to whether or not you can corroborate a story. So, the Times, not to beat up on the Times, because one of the issues for the Times is they're not going to run a story, even if they have somebody come to them with some great leak. They're not going to run a story unless they can get somebody else to say this is generally more or less true. The British press has generally been a little bit more kind of lenient in terms of what they're willing to just put out there in the broadsheets, which, on the one hand means that sometimes you get reporting that isn't great, but on the other, it does mean that even a conspiracy theory that might end up being true can end up out there. After that incident, when it came out that the NSA and the British agency were listening in on diplomats at the UN, the deputy editor of the Times said, well, we would have run a story, we thought it was really interesting, but we couldn't get anybody at the Pentagon to confirm it or to comment. And I mean, and sure enough, I mean, in the weeks that followed, Ari Fleischer and Donald Rumsfeld would just sort of say categorically no comment. I mean, it's a great strategy if you want somebody not to write anything at all. Maybe one more?
Where does the threat to liberty lie? Is there any imposition on liberty aside from privacy matters that you're aware of?
I feel as though privacy is a valid enough sort of component of liberty that's, I mean, I don't know that you actually need to get much beyond that, but I would say that, I mean, if in fact we have a future, say 10 years down the road, and there are many, many people who hope that this is the case, where everything is networked and databased, and it really, I could take your name or your social security number and put it into a database and come up with your last 10 phone calls, your last 10 emails, where you are right now, your last 10 credit card transactions. It's not purely in privacy terms that kind of an environment would worry me and feel not like the country I grew up in. And to give you actually a kind of a fairly vivid example of this, say you trust the government to keep these databases and not do anything. Just say for the sake of argument that we trust them all, they would never abuse this, we would never sort of tip over in a kind of vaguely tyrannical direction when we felt threatened from without. So say we trust them. They have these big databases with all of this material in there. Congress's General Accounting Office, which is the sort of neutral accounting wing of Congress, does an annual computer security report card. And the Department of Defense, which would presumably be maintaining some of these databases, this past year got its computer security report card, and it got a D. And Homeland Security, which would be even more aggressively into maintaining these databases, came out with an F last year. This is relative to, I mean, it's all like Department of the Environment, for whatever reason, they have these kind of terrific computer security for what, I don't know. But I think that to me is a very real menace. If you look at the dangers of identity thieves and hackers and various people who would really love to get their hands on a database that complete, if you're giving it to these people, even if you trust their intentions, if you don't trust their computer security.
This all stems from the National Security Act of 1952. Isn't that right?
How so?
Isn't that the legislation that authorized the NSA?
Well, no, because the NSA was not actually created by an act of Congress. It was created by executive order by Harry Truman. And in terms of the stuff I'm talking about, it's not the National Security Act. It's the Patriot Act in a lot of cases.
You're not aware of even one instance of violation of personal liberty?
Oh, sure. Look, I can give you. I mean, if there are. It's great. People always want these very real, tangible sort of names and faces of people, but there have been dozens of instances since September 11th of people, just to give you one example, getting onto no-fly lists for reasons they don't understand. When you get on, nobody tells you how you got on. It's incredibly hard to get off, and that's liberty of movement is automatically cut down. I mean, there are these sort of they're very kind of, it's almost a cliche, but, a sort of a small businessman in North Carolina who relies for his trade on getting around the country on, sort of domestic flights, and suddenly he's grounded and he doesn't know why, and it's almost a kind of a Kafkaesque situation where you can't figure out how he got onto the list, and he can't figure out how to get off. That, to me, is a pretty vivid curtailment of his liberties. Anyway, thank you all, and I'm happy to sign books, talk more. Thank you very much. I do, yeah.
Thank you, Patrick, Radden, Keefe. Thank you all for joining us. We have copies of Chatter to the front. We invite you to come up and have your book signed. Thank you and good evening.
Patrick Radden Keefe is a law student at Yale. Chatter, Dispatches from the Secret World of Global Eavesdropping is published by Random House. Visit randomhouse.com for more information.